Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for this video trunk show and lecture. It's a great way for me to stay connected to all of you until we can all get together again, hopefully later this year. I'm going to focus on three key elements of quilting for this lecture. First of all, the visual impact a quilt has on you. So what is it about a quilt that makes you notice it, maybe even from across the room, and make you want to really go explore it more? That's the first thing that hits all of us, is that visual impact. And the next thing that judges would notice is the mastery of techniques that were used in that quilt. So I want to share my applique technique with you, and then several other really fun techniques to try. And lastly, tips for finding your own creative voice. When you want to increase the visual impact of a quilt, it's helpful to know what our eyes are drawn to. Line, color, and shapes give our brains critical information as to what we are looking at. If we can incorporate interesting lines, interesting shapes, and interesting colors into our designs, then they have a high rate of being successful. Notice the interesting diagonal line created by the blocks on point in my friend Kathy Wiley's snowflake quilt. See those squares on point? They are also filled with really interesting star and paper cut shapes. The colors are complementary, and her use of value really makes the blocks pop away from the background. In my landscape quilt on the left, you notice the interesting lines created by the striations in the rocks and in the cliffs. And those red rock country colors are just glorious. Notice the use of light and dark fabrics. That helps in creating a sense of depth and also makes the rocks seem much more dimensional. I love the shapes created by erosion in the cliffs over hundreds of years, and I was really surprised hiking along the creeks how very green it was tucked back in those canyons. This quilt is my tribute to the Northwest where I live, and Mount Rainier really does seem to rise right out of the ocean. I used many of the iconic buildings like the lighthouse on San Juan Island and our own McConnor Quilt Museum to create my dream village. When I first began to enter shows, several times the judges commented there was not enough contrast, and that was a really helpful thing for me to focus on. Notice in this quilt that there's a contrast in the very linear architectural lines of the buildings with the horizontal lines in the water. There is also a contrast in the geometric shapes of the sky with the more organic shapes of the mountains and the hills and the trees. The sunset colors vary between the really warm colors, the pinks, yellows, and oranges, with the blues. And that contrast is reflected in the water also. The use of cool colors, greens, blues, and lavenders, helped really make this quilt more calming too. So my last name is McNeil, and my husband is insanely proud of his Scottish heritage. This quilt is called the Christmas Piper. Santa has a traditional tam hat and a bagpipe in his hands. And the little skating scene at the bottom was cut from a panel piece. The background fabric is a red brocade. When I'm planning colors for a quilt, it's really helpful for me to think about contrast too. And it can be as simple as areas that are light and areas that are darker, a mix of warm and cool colors, brights with neutrals like that background fabric behind the Santa, and usually a more dominant color or accent colors. And that could also be a more dominant color theme, like predominantly warm colors with accents of cool colors. Another fun way to include contrast is in texture. Our quilting of the 3 layers certainly brings a wonderful texture to our quilts. A variety of quilting designs always make a quilt more visually interesting too. I added a lot of hand embroidery on this quilt in the corner designs. Three-dimensional objects like beads or prairie points, those types of objects work really well too. A change in the scale size of objects or your change in the scale size of your blocks or different sections of the quilts will always enhance your composition too. A quilt doesn't have to have those bright, bold colors to make a strong visual impact. Look at how beautiful these monochromatic quilts are. The strong inner sawtooth border on the left creates a really pleasing visual line to separate the section on the pattern, and the star shapes vary in size and in value too. On the right, we have those great diagonal lines again, and there's a wonderful contrast in all of those various snowflake shapes. All quilts can benefit, whether they're traditional in style or contemporary art quilts, from having a focal area, a focal block, a focal object, or in the case of landscape quilts, it is a focal area generally. The viewer's eye starts there. That's with the area that they notice first, and then they begin to explore the entire quilt. To make sure you have a focal block or area, that area generally needs more emphasis. That emphasis can be created by using more detail, like the curvilinear shapes of wrought iron in the center of the traditional quilt on the left, and there's a strong color contrast there too. The complementary colors of purple and gold set off that design. And bless those folks that gave us those ombre fabrics. This quilt was made in quarter sections so that the lightest part of the ombre could create that look of luminosity. If you close your eyes tightly and then open them to look at my sea cave quilt, you will likely first focus on the center of the cave. That is where the most contrast is. It has an almost black interior with a very light scene right behind it. So more saturated colors, more contrast, more details, all those types of things can create emphasis. Basically, you need more of something. Think of all those traditional medallion quilts, maybe with a 36-point mariner's compass in the center, often surrounded by smaller 12-point star blocks. Oh, the Victorian age, one of my very favorite times in history. I love the dresses with all those tiny buttons, the horses and carriages, Downton Abbey. I learned applique from reading Ellie Sintavich's books. Ellie loved the language of flowers and passed that on to many of us. In the Victorian era, you brought a small bouquet of flowers with you to your host when you went for tea. That bouquet was called a tussie mussy, and I love that phrase. I have no idea where that came from. So floral dictionaries, though, were carried by proper young ladies to decode what messages were being sent with the meaning of the flowers in that little tussie mussy. Nowadays, we still give red roses for love and poppies for remembrance. When American Quilters Society, AQS, asked me to design a Block of the Month quilt for them, I was able to use my love of flowers and their meanings in the blocks. Unity versus variety is another helpful way to think about quilt designs. Some of my blocks are vertical and some are horizontal, but they all have flowers and ribbons. The colors are varied in each block, but they are all surrounded with the same black and white grill work frame. Is there something that pulls your whole quilt together? So unity is best achieved with repetition. It can be repeating a color in one area in another. You can repeat shapes, prints, textures. Just make sure that there's also enough variety to give the whole thing some spice. My finished quilt has 380 little 1/4-inch black buttons in the border. There are a variety of blocks. You can make just individual wall hangings with each of the blocks, like the friendship block. People have used them in tote bags or as gifts. The new beginnings block is perfect for someone moving or starting a new job. There's a never forget block, a comfort block for someone who is ill, and many others. These individual blocks or the entire quilt pattern is available on my website. So since how I developed this lecture right in December at Christmas time, I thought I would take a look at poinsettias and holly too. So the poinsettias was interesting because what I thought were petals are actually colored leaves known as bracts. And it's often used, it blooms at Christmas time, but it also is a symbol of the Star of Bethlehem with their star shapes in the petals. And then holly is known as a Christmas plant due to the fact that the female holly bushes grow bright red berries around the holiday season. And among the background of the deep leaves, these red berries really pop. Even though the holly berries have been adopted as traditional Christmas decor, that symbolism dates way back to the ancient Druids, and this plant was being representative of everlasting life. Now to the mastery of techniques. So no matter how long you have been quilting, this is always going to be a work in progress. I am pretty good at applique, but my piecing skills are really basic, and there are so many techniques to try. So I want to explain some of my favorites. My quilts begin with a drawing, more like a sketch than a paint by number exact pattern. That drawing gives me the approximate size of objects like horses and areas to be collaged together like the snowy hills in the background. And I always start with my main characters first, which is different than many other pictorial art teachers. I didn't know that most people started in the background. And if you're fusing, that makes sense, as you have to fuse on top of other pieces as you go. But when I started, I was still working long hours at the hospital and taking a lot of emergency call. And I thought it must be more like an author writing a book. You would start with your main characters. If it was going to be horses, then you'd figure out how to draw them, make a pattern from that, go find the right fabrics to use, and then put that all together and make sure it worked first. After that, then I would start making my supporting cast, or the scene, and only at the very end do I ever audition sky or water. So my method is much like flannel board in Sunday school. Everything is made in units. Those units can be moved around. As I make each object, I pin it over the drawing on my design wall. And then, like the in progress picture here, I start hand appliquing sections together. So now you can see I have 2 horses made, and they have been sewn together. Parts of the background scenes are starting, and they are just pinned to the design wall. And as I create more rocks and snow, those units will be joined in larger and larger sections, much like sewing blocks to blocks. So there's nothing behind like muslin or just a white fabric or anything behind. They are just sewn section by section to the next bigger objects or units. The finished quilt is called Jingle Bells, and the title on the border was thread painted with metallic gold thread. The bells were made with gold lame, a truly terrible, no good, awful fabric to work with. And the sky was hand painted on prepared for dyeing white fabric by me. I'm going to show you a close-up, and on this detail shot you can see that I'm just pinning the yoke into position before I applique on the jingle bells. This whole quilt was inspired by a great family Christmas memory. We took our kids and grandkids and went away to a cabin in the mountains, and there was a rancher in the area who had put up a sign at the little store offering sleigh rides. So we signed up for a sleigh ride, and he arrived, and it was only one other couple and our little family. And he, I think, was about 80 years old and not real happy about being out in the freezing cold, but he was trying to make money around the winter time. So he had hitched up his team and put runners on his wagon and turned it into sleigh rides. My granddaughters were 4 and 2 at the time, and the only little kids on the sleigh. So he was trying to do his tourist thing, and he said to Haley, our oldest, he said, "So little girl, what did you get for Christmas?" And Haley said, "A bow and arrow." And he said, "You got a bow and arrow? What are you going to shoot?" And she said, "Bears." "Well, just the mean bears." And indeed, she had just seen the movie Brave, and she did want a bow and arrow. And he was so taken with this little girl who was going to go out and shoot those bears that he said, "Do you want to sit on my lap and drive these horses?" And she looked at him with big eyes, and she said, "Yes, sir, I do." And that was the inspiration for making this quilt. So it's been really cold outside, so let's take a tropical trip. These beautiful creatures are called spotted eagle rays. They float through the sea like tropical butterflies and even occasionally leap right out of the water. I think they are messengers reminding us to take care of our coral reefs because so many of the reefs around the world are disappearing due to global warming and pollution. I love those dramatic black and white spots till I ended up having to make over 1,600 of them. Each turned using my favorite applique method of turning your edges, and then they each had to be painted with a black dot too. Sometimes my creativity borders on a bit crazy. This is a detailed shot of the collage coral reef and all of the shapes. The sea fans are made entirely of thread. And this is a really fun technique, and we sell these kits with the instructions on my website. But basically it's a layer of tulle and then a layer of water dissolvable solvay and another layer of tulle. And those are hooped up, and then you can trace the coral, the sea fans, and then you just, with your free motion quilting, your feed doggies down, you just fill in that shape with thread. It's a really fun technique, and you can create wonderful textural changes with that. On the coral, there's lots and lots of hand-embroidered French knots. And if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, you will see yo-yos. They make great little sea anemones. Now I want to show you a video of the applique technique of turning your edges. I discovered these tools from Spain about 6 years ago, and they have changed my and my students' lives. Excuse me. Applique is the most precise, fastest, and easiest way to applique that I have found in my 20 years of teaching applique. So these tools from Spain are all ergonomically designed. They come with 2 rods, some wonderful scooping tweezers. The scissors all have 3-point contacts so that you have wonderful control as you're cutting. And you start with interfacing. So this interfacing is impregnated with a little bit of glue. You can see the shine on the top. You trace over the shape that you want, and then you would cut that out exactly on the line. The interfacing is then fused or ironed on to the back side of your fabric. Much like freezer paper, it will peel off, but it will stick just enough so that you can cut a seam allowance. Then you're going to want to glue up that seam allowance. Doesn't matter if it goes a little on the interfacing or on the fabric. And that water-soluble glue pen will dry clear. And you're going to take your rods. One of the rods has that fork and holds the piece in good position for you. And the other one has a beveled edge. And you can see that you're just sweeping that seam allowance over the top of the interfacing. And unlike freezer paper, which you have to get back out of there, disrupting all your edges, this is interfacing just like you would have in the collar of your shirt, and it's going to stay in there. And if anything, it helps you create a little extra loft and dimension. It also acts as a stabilizer so that I can put all those French knots on there without having to have anything else behind it. So as each little unit is turned and prepared, then it would be just placed into position. So I'll take this little piece of the coral and I'm just going to find where it would look good with the rest of the coral pieces. I would just pin base that together and then pick that up and applique those shapes together. And then that gets taken to my design wall and pinned up on the design wall after I added the French knots. Another mysterious, playful, and amazing escape artist of the deep are these giant Pacific octopuses. They have this wonderful great pink color when they become excited or agitated. The hardest part of making an octopus, I discovered, was making all those suckers. I tried and tried several different techniques to come up with little suckers, and what finally worked was making very sloppy little yo-yos from silk organza. And then I just painted the center of them. And when I went to put them up on top of that right uppermost arm that you can see there, I just pinned them along the side of her leg. And I got so excited, I was jumping up and down and clapping. And then I looked at those 7 other longer, much bigger legs and realized I had a long way to go. There ended up being 321 of those little yo-yo suckers. Another fun thing that I did on this quilt was I didn't really want to have a very strong, large border around it because it didn't fit in with the Art Nouveau sort of style I was using. So I found this wonderful yarn that kind of looked like fisherman's net, and I simply place that over the top of the binding and then just hand tack that onto the binding. And I love this quilt because I love octopuses, but it's also my very favorite award too, one of my very favorites, because it did win Best Original Design twice with AQS shows. And I think it's because nobody in their right mind would think of putting an octopus in a beautiful Art Nouveau sort of setting. But I just kept thinking of her as a diva of the deep, and thought, like all of those beautiful women that you usually see in the Art Nouveau designs, that it would be really fun to put her in that position. So looking at what appears to be her nose or face, note that the shading from the light area on the original fabric on top is shaded as we come around towards the side to create a sense of form. And that shading was done with my favorite paints. And I love these professional watercolor paints. They are transparent, they're water soluble, so they leave the fabric soft for my hand applique. And they have wonderful light fastness, and you just heat set them with your iron. So let me show you how these work. Here is that base fabric I was using in her face. This is just water in a spray bottle. This is just water. So I'm just getting this fabric wet, and then I can either just take my pink paint crayon and I can just start adding in a little color and just gradually gently dispersing that in the area that I want it to be. And I can make this, you know, pretty light out here, and then just continue to add color as I want it to become a little stronger. So we'll just add a little bit. I know you guys can all color. This is so easy with crayons. So just get this gradually. You can see I'm just working the shading in from, get out of there, a little string, from this area to this area so that it becomes a little stronger. If I want it at this point to maybe start adding in some of the purples, I can also always just mix, because the fabric, the paint is released once it's wet. So I can just go ahead and get some of the paint off the crayon here and a little bit of water in my palette. This is what I love about these crayons. They just go back in their box. But now, of course, you can always mix colors too. So I can add a little bit of purple to that so that we can even start shading that now in with some of the purples in here. And depending on how you know, dilute you make this, is what the strength will be here. And I'm going to start changing into more and more purples to get darker. So, and that's about, you know, all it is, and then you just let them dry out. But that way you can, you know, make your own gradations. I could add in oranges if I wanted, or reds if I wanted. And then I'll wash this brush out a little bit. And then on this one, I wanted to have part of it be green. So we'll just over dye this. So basically you're adding dye pigments to the print, and because they're transparent, you can see how easily you can show through that print. Of course, they're going to be a little bit darker when they're wet, just like paint on your wall when you're painting. They'll dry a little bit lighter, but that's always nice for me because then I don't have to worry about whether I got it too dark or not. You can, you know, let it stay more in a line like that, or you can, you know, go ahead and blend it into the areas that you would want. We sell these paint sets of 10 basic colors, my 2 favorite brushes, and a mixing palette, and instructions to use them on my website. Sometimes it's in looking back that you can look forward and evaluate, you know, what you have learned. In this quilt back from 1999, this Nutcracker quilt, which I was trying to capture the entire Nutcracker play in one whole quilt, when I look back at it now, I realize that if you look at the bottom right corner, there's all these little mice that are helping the Mouse King and fighting with him. They've got little swords and all kinds of little detail. But you really can't see them when you're standing a little bit away from the quilt, because they all do just mush into that background because there's not enough contrast. And where's the emphasis of this quilt? Well, basically with this quilt, you've got a problem in terms of competition, because between the Nutcracker and the Mouse King, you're not really sure what you're supposed to be looking at first. And then you've got lots and lots of varied scenes, so there's sometimes so much to try to explore that it can be a bit overwhelming. So what I try to do after I finish a quilt, because sometimes there's always areas that are still bugging me that I wish that somehow could have turned out better, but I like to think about what I learned, because every quilt has something that it taught you, and focus on what did work well. And also think about, you know, what areas do you really need more experience with? What areas do you need to improve on? With this quilt, I did have a lot of fun with the machine embroidery stitches and the little castle area up top. I don't often get to use those. But remember to be really kind to yourself as you develop those skills. So originality is about developing your own creative voice. And your goal as an artist is to put yourself and your unique vision into your work. So, do you have a favorite style? What are some of your favorite styles of art? Yeah, do you like abstract art? Do you like very realistic sorts of art? Big graphic, bold designs? Art Nouveau's beautiful curves? Are you in love with those geometrics? If you realize what types of art you're drawn to, then that is information that you can put back into creating your own style of quilts too. Maybe what's your favorite color palette? Are you drawn to those earth tones or soft pastels? Do you like those high contrast, bold, saturated colors? What's your favorite types of shapes? My favorite a traditional block is a feathered star. I love that shape. But I really love organic curvilinear shapes too. So between your favorite subject matter, your favorite types of shapes and lines, that can help you really communicate what you're trying to say in your quilts. Now, most of us do change the patterns we use or put our own personal spin on it by adding things, changing colors, different type of borders, different prints. That's exactly what you need to be doing and what I certainly want to encourage. So here's a look at symmetry and asymmetry and two types of designs where you sort of get started. So for me, symmetry is terrifying. I love these quilts when I go to quilt shows. Those incredible Japanese quilts with their taupe colors and beautiful, beautiful, precise, symmetrical shapes. The quilt on the left was made by me and my friend Jerry Parker, who is very good at paper piecing. But symmetry makes many people just be able to feel really relaxed and happy. So, do you thrive on that kind of order and precision, that type of simplicity and elegance? Or are you like me and really totally feel at home with asymmetry? Do you like more variety? Are you able to you're able to put more complex relationships together between all of the various elements? So think about what sort of style appeals to you. They both are basically made with different blocks that are put together, but the layout is a bit different. So Audubon's Christmas This quilt was my first AQS Block of the Month quilt, and we carried those, all of those various block patterns with all of the different birds and designs, and the entire quilt in my shop too. And also when I made this quilt, I went to Nashville and AQS had a big professional recording studio, and there were camera booms over my head and 3 other cameras on zooms. So you can really see me make this quilt actually block by block, what fabrics I chose, how I enhance those fabrics, maybe with the paints, the construction of each of those blocks, different techniques for applique and for the machine quilting machine applique. So there's about 3 days worth of classes in this $24 DVD, which you can also play in your computer. But you can see that the birds are made as units and they're all just made, and then I made some branches and I just plopped the birds where I thought they're nicely balanced out. Here's a really fun technique if you've never tried it or never heard of it, called shadow trapunto. So when I made the chickadee block, I really wanted my chickadees to be the star, but I was trying to have enough variety in each of the blocks to put other little supporting cast images in there. So this one wanted to have a birdhouse. But that birdhouse I didn't want to overshadow my little chickadees, so it's made with a shadow trapunto technique. And that technique is really useful if you're trying to add text or lettering to your quilts. maybe a date or numbers to your quilts. So basically what you're doing is you're taking some polyester felt, cutting out the shapes that you need, and then if your quilt top is light enough in color, you can put it on top of the batting and under the quilt top. And then if you outline quilt or quilt very tightly up to the edge of the felt, which you can definitely feel because it's raised, then that whole shape will trapunto up, really puff up, and the color will shadow through. And you can see that that's a very dark navy blue letter at the end there that's uncovered so you can see it. So it takes a very saturated color in order to get that shadow through. But it's a great technique for, say, the border of a baby quilt that you want to put their name on it or the date that they were born, or like a 50th wedding anniversary quilt. So it's a lovely technique to try and pretty easy to quilt around. So let's explore this modern quilt aesthetic. So the quilting world was turned up on its ears quite a few years ago now, it seems like, with the whole modern quilt trend. And at first I have to admit that I was a bit curmudgeonly about the whole thing and thought, what are these quilts about? But they gained an interest for a lot of people when people became so excited about them that they were really generating a whole new enthusiasm in our quilting community. Whole lines of fabric were being developed along these types of very bold, simple shapes, very graphic sorts of designs. It was bringing a lot of younger people into our quilting communities and a lot of older people who have been doing the same type of quilts for many years took a whack at this and really jumped out of their box and had a lot of fun too. So this is my first attempt at a modern quilt design, and my husband has a black belt in Aikido and Taekwondo, and one year he came home with a Christmas card that had this big circular Enzo shape in the center. And I read about the card on the back, that Enzo shape, and what it expresses is the moment when your mind is free to just let that body create. So the artist, the calligrapher, would get his brush filled with ink and then trying to just go to that place in his mind where he can let all the stressors of the world, all the things he's been worried about or needs to do, just pushing them away and just get into the flow of creating that circle in one non-stop motion, never leaving the paper with his brush. And when you get into that place, that zone where the rest of the world does fade back, and you're just having so much fun with color or so much fun putting the blocks together and seeing what they're going to look like finally, that time is just the magic moments of all of our lives. And scientists call that frame of mind when you're in the flow. This quilt's background, there's a lot of negative space in this quilt, so a lot of opportunity to put a variety of quilting designs. Notice that there's a change of scale size in the quilting designs. There's some very linear type shapes, some very curved type shapes, a little bit change in density in quilting areas. So I added the plum blossoms to symbolize my blossoming appreciation of this style of quilt. There's buttons, those little 1/4-inch black buttons are in here with some embroidery floss too to add additional texture to the little blossoms. Here's my newest modern quilt called Bliss, and I think most people would not associate this quilt with me, but it really has been fun to jump out of my box and play with some different sorts of ideas. You can see that modern quilts basically have really strong, wonderful shapes, strong, bold, colors, and really interesting lines. So my bliss, of course, is quilting, and Bruce's bliss is climbing mountains. So I have the sort of rising moon shape over the mountain. Again, those wonderful ombre fabrics. And the other trend that I'm really excited about is the more modern quilting designs. There's a lot more straight lines. There's a lot of secondary shapes that it creates. And it doesn't matter whether a shape goes on top of a block, underneath a block part of the time. It's just much more free form, and I think innovative and relaxing. So you don't have to have that perfect feathered, wreath around every single block. And it has to be absolutely symmetrical, which I explained is really terrifying for me. So here's a close-up of those quilting designs, and you can see I've got squares filled in with straight lines, and those rectangles or squares sometimes are overlapping, go in different directions. The little circle bubbles, some of them overlap on top of each other. They're different in scale and sizes, just to make it more interesting. But it's a really fun, new, much different sort of modern take on the quilting designs. And I'm often asked, well, how should I quilt this? And the easiest way to simplify that is to think about just dividing up your space into smaller and smaller shapes that you're going to fill in to make interesting textures with some straight lines, some curved lines. But you can see in this example that I'm not perfectly going around with another shape around that center sort of block. Just interlocking lots of different shapes and playing with lots of different texture. So I have a DVD that has 2 hours on it of everything you need to know about quilting on your domestic home machines, doing free motion quilting. And there's an extra CD with this package that's filled with all kinds of quilting designs and fillers and sample projects to work on. So COVID is a great time to practice your free motion quilting while we're at home. A lot of it is just getting in the mindset that you don't have to be perfect on it, and a lot of it is just repetition and time spent. But I think this is a fun way to approach it all. 3 years ago, this beautiful, beautiful picture on the cover of the National Geographic catalog that year just captured my heart. By the time I'd gotten back from my mailbox up to my house, I actually had tears in my eyes. Bruce and I have been married 50 years, and I thought this team just captured the devotion of a mated team so incredibly well, more than anything I had ever seen before. And I got so captivated by this photograph that I had the audacious idea of what if I could make that into a quilt. So I started flipping through the magazine to see who the photographer was. And I finally found her in the back, and her name is Cynthia Baldoff, and she has a wonderful website with lots of pictures. But at that time, she didn't. So I'm Googling her name, and I couldn't come up with anything. And then I found her on Facebook. And so I was so excited, and I sent her off a message, and it said, my name is Kathy McNeil. I make these quilts, pictorial quilts. I'm so in love with this photograph. I have tears in my eyes. Is there any way that you would allow me to use your photograph as the inspiration for a quilt? And what sorts of royalty fees would you charge? And I hit the computer, and bing, off it went. And then I sat there for a couple of minutes, and I thought, yeah, right. A National Geographic photographer is going to respond to your email, Kathy? Really? And all of a sudden the computer went bing, and something came back, and I opened it, and it was from her. And I read what she wrote, and I thought, what? Because she wrote, what photograph? What photograph? I wrote back to her. I said, the photograph that's on the cover of National Geographic. And she wrote back and she said, I have a photograph on the cover of National Geographic. She said, my computer is just blowing up. People are writing and congratulating me and all of this, and I have no idea what photo you guys are talking about. She said, I send my photos off to my agent, which is Getty Images, and I don't know if they're used by somebody until I would get a royalty check. She said, is there any way that you could take a picture or scan it so I would know what photo this is? And I said, heavens, yes, I'll scan it right now. So I scanned it and I sent it back to her. And she wrote back and she said, oh, that one. She said, that was just a magic moment. She said, it was shot at my neighbor's ranch in Montana in 40-degree below weather. She said, we were out helping him feed the cattle out on the range, and we had just pulled the team in to refill the wagon. And I just looked at them and I caught that moment where they were just cuddled up together in the cold. And oh, she said, I'm so excited about this. And she said, well, thank you so much for helping me figure out what is going on. She said, I will give you permission, one-time permission, to make a quilt from this, and I'm not going to charge you anything. So that was incredible until I started making it. And then I thought, oh my gosh, how am I going to make snow, ice, and frost in fabric? And I wrote to her and I said, Cynthia, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know. I'm not sure what I can do to make that frost and that ice. And she was my best cheerleader. And she said, oh, Kathy, keep going, keep going. You're doing great. I know it's going to turn out. And when it was all done, I sent it to her with a fear in my heart that she would actually like it. And she said, oh, I love it. I love it. Where can I see it? And I said, well, I entered it into the Paducah Fall Show in September. And if you could come, I will rent us a room and you can stay with me and we'll go to the show and you can see it there. And she came to the show. She was in her whole cowgirl regalia with her cowgirl hat and her big turquoise huge buckle and her boots up to her knees. And she was so much fun. She's really extroverted and she had the very best time standing with me in front of that quilt all day and talking to all of the quilters. So here's the finished quilt. And it won Best of Show that year. Totally still blows my mind. And how you make frost and ice and snow, or at least how I finally did it, was I went to the fabric store that carries a lot of bridal fabrics, and there was a lot of tulle that already had sequins or little beads, shiny beads and things in them. So that metallic thread, a lot of hand embroidery, a little bit of painting made what finally was working for the ice and snow. There's little actual metal brads for real horse tack in the little bridle thing, and lots of different sequins. And the story that a lot of people don't know about this quilt is that after it won so much money, which I never ever expected, Bruce and I decided that we really did want to give Cynthia an honorarium. So as a total surprise to her, we sent her a $1,000 check. And she took that check and she gave $500 of it to the rancher who owns that team. So that was a really special sort of pay it forward. So this quilt, it's about music, because sometimes I think music expresses our feelings even better than words can sometimes. But with this one, I just really wanted to push myself to be a little bit more abstract. So I didn't even start with a drawing. I just started with a cello shape. And then within that cello shape, I just started filling it up with sort of a wonky improvisational little 9-patch block, a bunch of flying geese, and some little spirals and dots and things. And then I started adding other sort of wonky musical instruments like the keyboard and that terrible Golda May fabric again for the French horn. So This is how creativity works for many of us. When you sort of starting in a place that doesn't feel real secure and known to you, is you start off with this really cool, interesting idea that you think is going to be awesome. And then you start making it and you start thinking, this is really pretty tricky. And then you get to the point where, at least I do, where you think, this is really going to turn out crappy. And then those little nasty little voices in your head that say, I'm crappy. And if you persevere and keep at it, even if you have to walk away several times or put it away for a week, um, keep going, because eventually you come to that place where maybe I can make this work. And back to the place where, wow, this is awesome, or at least parts of it are really awesome. And that's really important because we need to put more value on creativity in this country. It's not valued very highly. And there's some wonderful health benefits to creativity because when you get in that zone and that flow of creativity is just coming out of you and you have pushed those things away that are so stressful, your heart rate comes down, your blood pressure comes down, your serotonin levels go up like you're taking an antidepressant. And all of these little challenges and new techniques or working on your free motion quilting, all of this is so good for our memories because even when you're older, in your 80s or so, your brain can make new synapses in your brain. And so creativity is really a good thing for us to discover. So make time to play. Dedicate a place in your house to be creative, to leave your stuff out, to make a mess. Try new stuff. Make lots of mistakes, and find yourself in that flow. Another thing that I love to play with is borders, innovative borders. So when I go to shows or read quilt books and I see a border that I really am drawn to, that I think has great visual appeal, I take a photograph of that and I keep it in a folder on my computer. Because borders have wonderful things to offer in terms of design. So when students ask me, Kathy, does this quilt need a border or not? My answer is always, you can put a border on it or not put a border on it. But in my opinion, if it's going to have a border, then that border needs to be doing a job. Now that job may simply be to make the quilt, wide enough and long enough that the top isn't going to just slide off the bed. But if it's ever going to be hung up at a quilt show or hung on a wall, then people are going to view it as a piece of art. And then that border can do all kinds of wonderful things for your composition. It can really bring unity by repeating colors or fabrics or shapes from the center. It can add movement by really pulling your eye around the entire quilt with a color for a strong visual line. It can frame and focus your eye back into the composition. That's what borders are really good at doing. Or it can add balance to your whole composition. And it could add to your whole theme or storyline if there is one, about that quilt, what the story behind that quilt was. Oh, back before COVID, I hope we get our world back. I had the incredible good fortune of being able to teach quilting classes on cruises. So the days that we're at sea is when we hold classes. And of course, when we're in port, we go to port and explore all the wonderful things to find there with everybody else. We have open sew at night that you just can come to or not. And we have a couple of special parties on board too. So I teach for quiltcruises.com or Quilt Seminars at Sea. And this year I was supposed to go to Europe. Oh, we didn't go. And in January, next month, I was supposed to go to South America, Antarctica, teaching with Sue Nichols, one of my really good buddies. But unfortunately, that's not happening either. So my first cruise that I'm scheduled to teach on again is South America for 2022. But when Sue and I were teaching in New Zealand and Australia on a cruise, we were supposed to go down to Milford Sound. And so I developed this little landscape scene of Milford Sound to teach landscapes to my students. And we collected some wonderful Australian fabrics while we were there. But when I got home and this quilt was hanging on the wall, I decided that it really needed something more to jazz it up. So I simply took out my rotary cutter and I sliced and diced it into four separate panels of different widths. And then I staggered those and put them back together with some sashing and then a bunch of little just fused on fabrics from that Australian fabric collection. So I could even use more of those. So there's lots of fun things that you can do with borders that can really change a quilt. So here's my quilt called Spring Harmony, and my intention was to have a quilt of a Japanese garden. And you can see that I'm just starting to audition some sky behind all of the sections that have now been sewn together. And I'm about 400 hours into this quilt of hand applique. And it's still frustrating me because what I really wanted when I started was to have a torii gate, some sort of a torii gate, like you have when you enter Japanese gardens. You always go through that gate. And I wasn't sure how that could happen. And I thought about taking my rotary cutter out again and just slicing it into 3 different panels. And since I was 400 hours into this quilt, I decided to slow down a half a second and at least put some blue tape up there so I could see what that might look like. But indeed, that is what I did. I did cut it into those 3 panels, and the border was my torii gate. So I was able to make a triptych of it, put that little torii gate over the top. There's about 3 layers of applique interfacing in there to make that stiff enough to really stand up. But that quilt has done well in competition too. So in these stressful, troubled times that we are living through, I just have to say before we finish that I am so, so proud of being a quilter, because we always respond to need. There are so many quilts made for, floods and disasters or missions. Think of all the beautiful quilts of valor that have gone out to our veterans who made such sacrifices for our countries and their families too. And thousands upon thousands of masks that were made early in the pandemic. I'm sure all of you and I made so many masks then. And it just makes me feel like quilters are the most generous, the most loving people on the planet. And I also think that we're some of the happiest people on the planet because we have really found something that truly makes us happy. We just have to sit down in our quilting rooms and be able to sew for even a half an hour, and you get much happier. If you can't quilt that day and you just can stop on your way home from work at the local quilt shop, and look at the fabrics or pet them or grab a couple little fat quarters, it really makes your day so much brighter. And when scientists study happy people, they've found amazing things. So being happy really strengthens your immune system. And heavens knows we certainly need that right now. Happiness protects your heart, like I've already talked about. Happiness combats stress. They can actually measure stress hormones in your system, and happy people have 23% less stress hormones. Happy people have fewer aches and pains. I don't know about you, but I have new little chronic aches and pains here or there almost every day now. But when I'm quilting, I certainly don't notice them nearly so much as I do when you go lay down to be all quiet and go to sleep. And happiness lengthens our lives. In a study of 52 to 79-year-olds, happier people were 35% less likely to die over the course of 5 years. So that's really important stuff. So quilting isn't just something that you should feel guilty about that you took a couple hours out this morning and quilted. You know, it's a gift that you give to yourselves, to your families, and to your grandchildren. So stay healthy, be happy. My heart goes out to all of you with a big hug, and hopefully we will be all back together and see you at a big show or at your guild by the end of this coming year. Okay, thanks so much for joining me. Bye-bye.